Today, we are going to discuss ignorance, avijja, in Theravada Buddhism. Buddhism is the teaching of Lord Gautama Buddha, who lived and taught in India in the 6th and 5th century before Christ. Now, Buddha was born into a royal family as Prince Siddhartha in a place called Lumbini in the present day Nepal. Being a royal prince, he grew up with all the royal comforts and he was prevented from seeing any human suffering outside the royal palace. But as a young adult, he did witness human suffering in the form of old age, illness, and death. And when he came to know that human suffering is common to everybody, including himself and his loved ones, and that alarmed and shocked him. And he wanted to find a way out of human suffering. So at the age of 29, he left home and became a homeless ascetic, wanting to find a way out of human suffering. For the next 6 years, he practiced severe austerity and self mortification, believing that it will bring enlightenment and liberation from suffering. And during those 6 years, he was supported by 5 ascetic companions named Kondanya, Baddiya, Vappa, Mahanama, and Navsaji. And due to severe austerity and self mortification, ascetic Siddhartha became severely emaciated. He nearly died. But he discovered that this severe austerity and self mortification did not bring enlightenment or the liberation from suffering that he was expecting. So he gave it up and started meditating under a tree in a place called Bodh Gaya in India, meditating on in breath and out breath, Anapana Sati Bhavana. And he was successful. Through medication, he was able to eradicate all his mental defilements and to realize the Four Noble Truths. No assistance from any teacher. So at the age of 35 years, he attained enlightenment as a Samma Sambuddha. Having enlightened as a Samma Sambuddha, the Buddha decided to teach the Buddhist doctrine and the path of liberation that he discovered during the enlightenment process to others so that they could also practice and cultivate the same path and liberate themselves from suffering. So Buddha went to a place called Varanasi in India and delivered his first sermon called Dhammacakkappavattana Sutta, meaning turning of the wheel of truth, to the 5 ascetic companions who had supported him during those 6 years of severe austerity and self-mortification. The Four Noble Truths that the Buddha discovered during enlightenment are the truth of universal suffering, dukkha satcha, truth of the origin of suffering, samudaya satcha, truth of the cessation of suffering, nirodha satcha, and truth of the path leading to the cessation of suffering, magga satcha. So the second noble truth that the Buddha discovered is the cause, origin of suffering, and that is craving. And Buddha described three types of craving. Craving for sensual pleasures, kama tanha, craving for becoming, bhava tanha, and craving for non-becoming, vibhava tanha. Now this craving arises mainly due to ignorance of true reality of all existing mental and physical phenomena. Now, in many discourses, the Buddha has mentioned the reason for continued existence of living beings in this cycle of birth and death as the combination of ignorance and craving. In several discourses of Anamatagga Samyutta of Samyutta Nikaya, that is the collection of the Buddha's connected discourses addressing a group of monks, the Buddha said, monks, this cycle of birth and death is endless. The beginning of this extremely long journey cannot be discovered. These beings, hindered by ignorance and bound by craving, wander on in this endless journey. Now, in the Pali English Dictionary of the Pali Text Society, the word avijja is described as ignorance, the main root of evil and of continual birth. Now, this ignorance is not merely lack of knowledge about something. It is misconception or misunderstanding of true reality of things. And the Buddha said, ignorance is the root cause of all the mental defilements, suffering, and continued existence in the cycle of birth and death. And when ignorance is totally eradicated, and that is the end of suffering and continued existence. Now, Buddha has said in the Vibhanga Sutta of the Samyutta Nikaya that ignorance is the ignorance of the Four Noble Truths. Again, addressing a group of monks, the Buddha asked, what is the ignorance? And Buddha said, ignorance is not understanding suffering, not understanding the origin of suffering, not understanding the cessation of suffering, and not understanding the path leading to the cessation of suffering. Now, in the Buddhist scriptures, the two terms, ignorance and delusions, are sometimes used interchangeably. For example, if we take the three unwholesome roots, that is greed, raga, hatred, dosa, and delusion, moha. Moha means ignorance, delusions, as well as wrong view. And out of the three unwholesome roots, ignorance is the main root. And these three unwholesome roots are deeply embedded in our mind. And they are the main driving force to commit unwholesome actions that lead to suffering and continued existence in the cycle of birth and death. Now, ignorance is also the ignorance of the reality of all existing physical and mental phenomena. The Buddha has said that everything that exists in the world possesses three common characteristics. And they are: everything is impermanent, anicca; everything leads to suffering, dukkha; and none of them possess any permanence entity called self, anatta. And through ignorance and perverted mental thinking, unattractiveness is seen as attractiveness, impermanent seen as permanent, suffering is seen as pleasurable, and not self is seen as self. Now, the Buddha has described a group of mental defilements called latent tendencies, anusaya dhamma. Now, these latent tendencies exist at our subconscious level. And they are called latent because they can remain dormant from life to life, causing us to commit unwholesome actions and continue our existence in the cycle of birth and death. They are sort of like sleeping volcanoes, waiting for the right conditions to explode. And the right conditions for a latent tendency to become active is to receive an external sense object through one of our 6 internal sense doors. That's the eye, the ear, the nose, the tongue, the body, and the mind. Now, the 7 latent tendencies are desire for sensual pleasures, aversion, conceit, wrong view, doubt, desire for existence, and ignorance. Buddha also described another group of mental defilements called fermentations, asava. Now, these fermentations are similar to the intoxicants that are produced during the process of fermenting alcohol drinks. And similarly, these fermentations are mental intoxicants that corrode and corrupt our mind, giving rise to suffering and our continued existence in the cycle of birth and death. And the Buddha described 3 fermentations: fermentations of sensual desire, fermentation of desire for continued existence, and fermentation of ignorance. Now, in a discourse called Samma Ditti Sutta of the Majjhima Nikaya, which is a collection of the Buddha's middle-length discourses, Arahant Sariputta, who was one of the 2 chief disciples of the Buddha, showed that there is a mutual relationship between ignorance and the fermentations. He said, with the rising of the fermentations, there is the rising of ignorance. And with the cessation of the fermentations, there is the cessation of ignorance. And similarly, with the rising of ignorance, there is the rising of the fermentations. And with the cessation of ignorance, there is the cessation of the fermentations. So they have a mutual relationship. Now, Buddha has described yet another group of mental defilements called fetters, samyojana. Now, these fetters are chains or shackles that bind the sentient beings to the cycle of birth and death, the samsara. And the Buddha described 10 such fetters, including ignorance. And the 10 fetters are self-identity view, sakkaya ditthi, skeptical doubt, vichikicha, attachment to mere rites and rituals, silabhata paramasa, sensual desire, kamaraga, ill will, patiga, desire to be born in fine material Brahma worlds, ruparaga, desire to be born in formless Brahma worlds, aruparaga, conceit, mana, restlessness, uddacha, and ignorance, avijja. Now, ignorance has also been described as ignorance of dependent origination of paticca samuppada. Now, dependent origination is another key concept of Buddhist doctrine that the Buddha discovered during the process of enlightenment. Now, dependent origination explains how suffering begins and how we continue to exist in the cycle of birth and death, the samsara. It consists of 12 factors, and Buddha placed ignorance at the forefront of the 12 factors. The Buddha explained how dependent origination works like this. Conditioned by ignorance, mental formations arise. Conditioned by mental formations, consciousness arises. Conditioned by consciousness, mind and matter arise. Conditioned by mind and matter, the 6 sense bases arise. Conditions by the 6 sense bases, contact arises. Conditions by contact, feeling arises. Conditions by feeling, craving arises. Conditioned by craving, clinging arises. Conditions by clinging, becoming arises. Conditioned by becoming, birth arises. And conditioned by birth, all forms of suffering, such as aging, death, sorrow, lamentation, pain, grief, and despair arise. And Buddha also explained that in the reverse order of dependent origination, when one eradicates the ignorance completely through developing true wisdom, the other factors of dependent origination also cease to arise, eradicating suffering. Now, in a discourse called Avijja Sutta of the Anguttara Nikaya, that's a collection of the Buddha's numerical discourses. The Buddha described 5 mental hindrances as the nutrients of ignorance. Now, mental hindrances are mental defilements that can affect our mind during our meditation, hindering the development of concentration and insight. And the 5 mental hindrances, pancha nivarana, are sensual desire, kama chanda, ill will, vyapada, sloth and torpor, tinamidda, restlessness and remorse, uddacha kukucha, skeptical doubt, vichikicha. Now, in another discourse called Samudaya Dhamma Sutta of the Samyutta Nikaya, the Buddha described ignorance as ignorance of the origination and passing away of the 5 aggregates of clinging, pancha upadana khanda. Now, Buddha has said that what we call a person or an individual is made up of these 5 aggregates of clinging. And they rise and passes away, and there is no stability in them. The 5 aggregates of clinging are materiality or form, rupa, feeling, vedana, perception, sanya, mental formation, sankara, and consciousness, vijnana. And because all these 5 aggregates are transient, impermanent, and are in a constant state of flux, if we identify with any of them as I or me, it can only lead to suffering. Now, how can one eradicate ignorance? And that is by developing wisdom, and that is avijja or panya in the Pali language. Now, ignorance is the main cause of suffering and continued existence in the samsara. So, by developing wisdom, one should be able to eradicate suffering and escape from continued existence in the cycle of birth and death. Now, while describing the 4th noble truth, the Buddha said that the path to eradicate all suffering is to cultivate the middle path of the Noble Eightfold Path. And the Buddha discovered the Noble Eightfold Path during the process of enlightenment and then declared it to the world. The Noble Eightfold Path provides practical steps that anyone can cultivate in order to attain the state of enlightenment and Nibbana. And that is the end of all suffering. Now, the Noble Eightfold Path consists of 8 factors: right view, samadhi, right intention, samma sankappa, right speech, samma vacha, right action, samma kammanta, right livelihood, samma ajiva, right effort, samma vayama, right mindfulness, samma sati, and right concentration, samma samadhi. Now, for practical purposes, these 8 factors can be divided into 3 groups. The first group is morality or sila, and that consists of right speech, right action, and right livelihood. The second group is concentration or samadhi, and that consists of right effort, right mindfulness, and right concentration. The third group is wisdom, panya, and that consists of right understanding and right intention. Now, when a Buddhist disciple cultivates the Noble Eightfold Path successfully with diligence as instructed by the Buddha, one can attain enlightenment or Nibbana through 4 progressive supramundane stages. The first stage of enlightenment is stream enterer, Srotapanna. The second stage is once returner, Sakadagami. Non-returner, Anagami, is the third stage, while the fourth and the final stage of enlightenment is Arahant. So, ignorance, which is ignorance of the Four Noble Truths, ignorance of the three universal characteristics, ignorance of dependent origination, and 5 aggregates of clinging, which is also a latent tendency, anusaya, a fermentation, asava, and a fetter, sangyojana, is totally eradicated in an arahant by cultivating the Noble Eightfold Path and developing true wisdom into reality. An arahant is fully enlightened, has attained nibbana, and is liberated from all suffering and the cycle of birth and death, the samsara. Thank you very much.